A 27-year-old book collector named Harry Elkins Widener boarded the most famous ship ever built. His father George came along, so did his mother Eleanor. They had spent weeks in Europe buying rare books and visiting old friends. Now they were going home. Harry carried a small leather case. Inside was a 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's Essays. He had paid £260 for it in London. He joked to a friend that if the ship went down, at least he would have something to read. The ship was the Titanic. Harry's grandfather had helped pay for it. Peter Arrell Browne Widener was one of the investors behind the International Mercantile Marine Company, the trust that controlled the White Star Line. He had made his fortune in streetcars and steel. By 1912, he was one of the 40 richest Americans who ever lived. He owned a 110-room mansion filled with Rembrandts and Raphaels. He had dined with presidents. He had built an empire. On the morning of April 16th, a telegram arrived at that mansion. His son and grandson were dead. Their bodies would never be recovered. Eleanor had survived by climbing into a lifeboat. The little Bacon went down with Harry. Peter Widener lived 3 more years. Doctors said he died of old age and diabetes. Everyone else said he died of grief. What the family did with their sorrow reshaped American culture. Eleanor built Harvard's largest library. Joseph gave 2,000 masterpieces to the National Gallery. Eleanor remarried and explored the Amazon. The mansion itself stood empty for decades, stripped and abandoned, waiting. This is the family that turned tragedy into monuments. But before the disaster, before the paintings, before the library, there was a boy in Philadelphia learning to cut meat in his father's shop. That is where we begin. Chapter 1: The Butcher Who Became a Billionaire. The boy learned to handle a knife before he learned to read properly. Peter Arrell Browne Widener was born on November 13th, 1834, in Philadelphia. His father laid bricks. His mother kept house. The family had immigrated from Germany a generation earlier, and they lived the way most immigrant families lived, hand to mouth, day to day. Philadelphia in the 1840s was a city of contrasts. Wealthy merchants built townhouses on Chestnut Street, while working families crowded into narrow row houses a few blocks away. Peter grew up on the wrong side of that divide. But he was observant. He watched how money moved through the city. He noticed who had it and who did not. At 13, he apprenticed at his older brother's butcher shop. The work was physical. Cold mornings, heavy carcasses, blood on the floor that had to be scrubbed clean before closing. Peter learned to break down an animal with speed and precision. More importantly, he learned to manage inventory, negotiate with suppliers, and keep customers coming back. By his early 20s, he had saved enough to open his own shop in a local market. It was modest: a counter, some hooks, a scale. But Peter understood something that other butchers did not. The shop was not just a place to sell meat, it was a place to make connections. He turned the counter into a gathering spot. Men came to buy their weekly roast and stayed to talk politics. Peter had opinions. He shared them freely. He remembered names, asked about families, offered credit to those who needed it. The Republican Party took notice of this young butcher who seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. By 1867, they placed him on the Philadelphia Board of Education. He was 32 years old. Then the country tore itself apart. The Civil War transformed Philadelphia into a military city. Union troops poured through on their way south. The wounded poured back. Hospitals multiplied across the city. Satterley Hospital alone held over 3,000 beds, making it one of the largest military hospitals in the world. Soldiers needed to eat. The War Department needed suppliers it could trust. Peter Widener submitted a bid to provide mutton to all Union forces within 10 miles of Philadelphia. He won the contract. For the next several years, his operation expanded far beyond a single market stall. He coordinated shipments, hired workers, and managed logistics on a scale he had never attempted before. The profits accumulated steadily. By the war's end, he had saved approximately $50,000. Adjusted for inflation, that sum would exceed $1.5 million today. Most men would have been satisfied. Peter Widener was not most men. He had tasted what real money could do. It opened doors. It attracted powerful friends. It created options. And he had watched Philadelphia closely during those war years. The city was growing. Factories were hiring. Workers needed transportation. The existing system of horse-drawn streetcars was a patchwork of small companies, each serving its own neighborhood, none of them efficient. Widener saw the future before others did. Whoever controlled how people moved through the city would control the city itself. In 1873, opportunity arrived unexpectedly. The Philadelphia city treasurer was convicted of conspiracy and removed from office. The Republican machine needed a replacement with a clean reputation and business experience. They offered the position to Peter Widener. He accepted. The job paid modestly. That was not the point. For 4 years, Widener sat at the center of Philadelphia's finances. He learned how municipal contracts were awarded. He met every banker, every developer, every politician who mattered. And he formed a partnership that would reshape American transportation. William Lukens Elkins had made his money in oil refining and refrigerated groceries. He was shrewd, ambitious, and looking for the next opportunity. When he met Widener, the two men recognized a shared vision immediately. They did not want to build a business. They wanted to build a monopoly. In 1875, they began buying streetcar franchises, one line at a time, one neighborhood at a time. They brought in William Kemble, a political fixer who could smooth the way with city officials. The strategy was patient and methodical. Acquire a small company, improve its operations, acquire the next one. The same year, Peter married Hannah Josephine Dunton. She was practical, steady, and comfortable with her husband's relentless ambition. They would have 3 sons together. The eldest, Harry, died of typhoid fever at age 11. The second, George, would grow up to manage the family businesses. The third, Joseph, would outlive them all. But in 1875, all of that was still ahead. Peter Widener had his capital, his partner, and his plan. Philadelphia's streetcars were about to become something much larger. The butcher had put down his knife. He was ready to build an empire. Chapter 2. The Streetcar Empire. The partnership between Peter Widener and William Elkins moved faster than anyone expected. By 1880, they had acquired a dozen streetcar franchises across Philadelphia. By 1883, they had merged them all into a single operation. The Philadelphia Traction Company changed everything. Before Widener and Elkins, public transportation in Philadelphia was chaos. Dozens of small operators ran competing routes. Schedules were unreliable. Transfers required separate fares. Workers who lived in Kensington could barely reach jobs in Center City. The system failed the very people who needed it most. Widener understood that the problem was not the streetcars themselves. It was the fragmentation. One company, properly managed, could coordinate schedules, standardize fares, and invest in better equipment. One company could negotiate from a position of strength. One company could print money. The Philadelphia Traction Company became that company. The unification required political skill as much as capital. Every franchise came with its own contracts, its own aldermen, its own network of favours owed and favours expected. Kemble handled the delicate work of keeping officials cooperative. Elkins managed the finances. Widener provided the strategy and the public face. Together, they created a machine. The streetcar routes expanded into neighbourhoods that had never had reliable service. Property values rose wherever the tracks appeared. Widener and Elkins purchased land ahead of their expansion, developed it, and sold it at enormous profits. The streetcar business was lucrative. The real estate operation built on top of it was even better. Then came electricity. In 1892, the Philadelphia Traction Company began converting its horse-drawn cars to electric power. The transformation was dramatic. Electric trolleys moved faster, carried more passengers, and required less maintenance. Operating costs dropped, ridership soared, profits multiplied. Widener watched his competitors struggle to adapt. Many lacked the capital to electrify. Others hesitated, unsure whether the technology would prove reliable. Widener did not hesitate. He invested heavily in new equipment, new power stations, new track. By the mid-90s, Philadelphia had one of the most modern transit systems in America. But Philadelphia was not enough. The same fragmented landscape that Widener had found in his home territory existed in urban centers across the country: New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. Each metropolis had its patchwork of competing streetcar operators. Each was waiting for someone with capital and nerve to unify them. Widener and Elkins extended their reach methodically. They acquired controlling interests in transit operations from the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Lakes. They brought in local partners who knew the political terrain. They applied the same formula that had worked in Philadelphia: combine, electrify, expand. By the turn of the century, their network stretched across more than 500 miles of track. They controlled the daily commute of millions of Americans: workers who rode to factories, clerks who traveled to offices, families who ventured downtown for shopping. All of them dropped their nickels into turnstiles that fed the Widener and Elkins treasury. The returns were staggering, but they came with controversy. Critics accused the traction magnates of corrupting governments, of extracting monopoly rents from captive riders, of prioritizing dividends over service. Reformers called for public ownership of transit. Newspapers published exposés about the political influence that Widener wielded. Widener rarely responded to the criticism. He believed that private enterprise, properly incentivized, would always outperform government bureaucracy. He pointed to the modern equipment, the expanded coverage, the reliable schedules. He argued that his investors deserved returns on their capital. Whether the public agreed was, in his view, beside the point. The streetcar business made Widener spectacularly rich, but it also connected him to a network of industrialists who were reshaping America. J.P. Morgan, who was assembling railroads and steel companies into giant trusts. Andrew Carnegie, who was building the largest steel operation in the world. Thomas Fortune Ryan, who controlled transit in New York. These were men who thought in terms of industries, not individual enterprises. Systems, not products. Widener joined their ranks. He invested in U.S. Steel when Morgan formed it in 1901. He participated in the American Tobacco Company. He bought stakes in banks, in real estate developments, in anything that promised returns at scale. And in 1902, he made an investment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. J.P. Morgan was assembling a trust to dominate transatlantic passenger shipping. The International Mercantile Marine Company would absorb the great steamship operators of the Atlantic, creating a single entity that could coordinate schedules, control fares, and squeeze out competitors. Morgan invited Widener to participate. Among the holdings was a British passenger operator called White Star and its shipbuilder, Harland and Wolff. 10 years later, White Star would launch a vessel called Titanic. Peter Widener's son and grandson would be aboard, but in 1902, all of that was unimaginable. Widener was at the peak of his powers. He had a growing fortune, a stable of profitable businesses, and 2 surviving sons to carry on his legacy. He had also begun planning something that would outlast all of it. He wanted to build a house worthy of his achievements, something that would announce to Philadelphia and to America exactly who Peter Arrell Browne Widener had become. Chapter 3. Lynnewood Hall. In 1896, Hannah Josephine Widener died aboard the family yacht off the coast of Maine. She was 60 years old. Peter had been married to her for nearly 4 decades. The loss changed him. The mansion on North Broad Street, where they had raised their sons and hosted Philadelphia society, now felt like a monument to grief. Widener decided to start fresh. He would leave the city behind and build something new, something that matched the scale of what he had become. He purchased 300 acres in Elkins Park, a quiet suburb north of Philadelphia. The land rolled gently across meadows and woodlands, far from the noise and smoke of the urban core. Here, Widener would construct the grandest private residence America had ever seen. For the commission, he turned to Horace Trumbauer. Trumbauer was an unlikely choice. He had no formal architectural training. He had never attended university. He had started as an office boy at a Philadelphia firm and worked his way up through draftsmanship and determination. But he understood what wealthy clients wanted. He could translate their ambitions into limestone and marble. Widener gave Trumbauer a single instruction: study Prior Park. Prior Park was an 18th-century Palladian mansion near Bath, England. It sat on a hillside overlooking manicured gardens, its central block flanked by curving colonnades that swept outward like welcoming arms. The design represented aristocratic permanence, old money, European sophistication, everything that Peter Widener, the bricklayer's son from Philadelphia, wanted to project. Trumbauer traveled to England. He measured, he sketched, he photographed. Then he returned to Pennsylvania and designed something even larger. Construction began in 1897. For 2 years, workers swarmed the site. They laid foundations deep into the earth. They raised walls of Indiana limestone, pale and gleaming. They fitted the interior with oak paneling, gilded ceilings, and crystal chandeliers that weighed hundreds of pounds. Furniture arrived from France. Tapestries came from the collections of European aristocrats. Bronze doors were cast in Florence. The ballroom alone could accommodate 1,000 guests. Its ceiling featured murals painted by Italian craftsmen who had been brought across the Atlantic specifically for the project. The entrance hall rose 2 stories, supported by columns of green marble. A grand staircase swept upward, its balustrades cast in bronze. Every detail announced wealth and permanence. This was not a house. It was a statement. The grounds matched the architecture. Trumbauer designed formal gardens in the Italian style, with clipped hedges, geometric flower beds, and fountains that sparkled in the summer sun. Greenhouses supplied fresh flowers year-round. Stables housed horses for the family's carriages. A gatehouse guarded the entrance from the public road. The final cost exceeded $8 million. In today's terms, that would approach $300 million. On December 19th, 1899, Peter Widener opened his new residence with a gala that stunned Philadelphia society. 400 guests arrived by carriage and motorcar, passing through iron gates and up a sweeping drive lined with mature trees. The New York Symphony provided music. They entered the Great Hall and found themselves surrounded by treasures. Paintings by old masters hung on every wall. Sculptures occupied niches and pedestals. The newspapers called it the finest private home in America. Some compared it to the palaces of Europe. Others noted, with varying degrees of admiration and resentment, that a man who had started with nothing now lived like a king. Widener himself seemed satisfied, but not boastful. He had built Lynnewood Hall for a purpose beyond display. The residence would house his art collection, which he intended to share with the public. He would open the galleries each summer, allowing visitors to see works that rivaled the holdings of any museum. Culture, he believed, elevated society, and he had the means to provide it. His son George moved into the estate with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children. The youngest generation would grow up wandering those marble halls, surrounded by Rembrandts and Raphaels, attended by servants, insulated from ordinary life. One of those children was a boy named Harry. He was 14 years old when Lynnewood Hall opened. Already, he was developing a passion that would define his short life. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, Peter Widener had achieved something remarkable. The immigrant bricklayer's son had built a palace, and he had filled it with beauty. Chapter 4. The Widener Art Collection. Peter Widener did not set out to become one of the greatest art collectors in American history. He started buying paintings because that was what wealthy men did. In the 1880s, as his streetcar fortune grew, Widener began acquiring works for his townhouse on North Broad Street. The early purchases were conventional: landscapes, portraits, decorative pieces that announced prosperity without demanding much attention. They filled the walls nicely. They impressed visitors. They served their purpose. Then something shifted. Widener developed an eye. He started reading about the old masters. He consulted dealers who recognized his growing sophistication. He traveled to Europe and walked through the galleries of London, Paris, and Rome. What he saw there changed his understanding of what art could be. He wanted the best. Not reproductions, not second-tier works by famous names. He wanted masterpieces. The dealers took notice. Joseph Duveen, the most influential art merchant of the era, cultivated Widener as a client. Duveen had access to aristocratic collections across Europe. Families who had held paintings for generations were now, under financial pressure, willing to sell. Duveen connected buyers with sellers and took handsome commissions from both. Through Duveen and others, Widener assembled a collection that rivaled any private holding in the world. The Rembrandts came first. Widener eventually owned 14 works by the Dutch master, more than any private collector except the British royal family. Among them was The Mill, a brooding landscape that art historians consider one of Rembrandt's finest achievements. The painting had belonged to the Marquis of Lansdowne before Widener acquired it in 1911 for £100,000, a sum that made headlines across Europe. Raphael followed. The small Cowper Madonna, painted around 1505, depicted the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ against a serene Italian landscape. Duveen brothers secured it in 1914. It was intimate, luminous, and worth more than most men would earn in 100 lifetimes. Vermeer was rarer still. Only about 36 paintings by the Dutch artist survive today. Widener owned Woman Holding a Balance, a quiet meditation on judgment and mortality. A woman in a blue jacket stands before a table scattered with pearls and gold, holding empty scales in perfect equilibrium. Behind her hangs a painting of the Last Judgment, a reminder that all earthly treasures must ultimately be weighed. Van Dyck, El Greco, Titian. Bellini, Gainsborough, Manet. The names accumulated like a roll call of Western civilization's greatest visual achievements. Widener did not simply buy paintings. He built spaces to display them properly. At Lynnewood Hall, entire wings were dedicated to the collection. Trumbauer designed galleries for different schools and artists. The Van Dyck Room, added in 1908, showcased portraits of European aristocrats against velvet-covered walls. The lighting was revolutionary. Widener installed a system of diffused skylights and adjustable fins that directed natural light onto the canvases without causing glare or damage. Curators from major museums came to study the arrangement. Every summer, from June through October, Widener opened the galleries to the public. Visitors could apply for admission and tour the collection free of charge. Thousands came each year. For many Americans, Lynnewood Hall offered their first encounter with works they had only read about in books. Widener believed that art belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. He saw his collection as a public trust, temporarily housed in a private residence. The paintings would outlast him. They deserved to be seen. His younger son, Joseph, shared this conviction. Where George focused on business, Joseph devoted himself to the collection. He studied art history. He refined his father's acquisitions, trading lesser works for greater ones. He developed relationships with scholars and museum directors. Under Joseph's stewardship, the Widener collection became not just large, but coherent. It told a story about European painting from the Renaissance through the 19th century. Father and son sometimes disagreed about individual purchases. Peter favoured Dutch and Flemish masters. Joseph appreciated Italian Renaissance works, but they agreed on the fundamental principle: quality over quantity, masterpieces over curiosities. The paintings hung in their galleries, illuminated by carefully calibrated light, waiting for visitors who would never forget what they saw. And in a smaller room nearby, another collection was taking shape. Peter's grandson, Harry, had begun gathering treasures of his own. His passion was not canvas and oil. It was paper and ink, rare books, first editions, works that most people had only heard of. That collection would follow him aboard a ship, and it would make him immortal. Chapter 5. Harry Elkins Widener. Harry Elkins Widener was born on January 3, 1885, into a world of extraordinary privilege. His father, George, ran the family's streetcar operations. His mother, Eleanor, was the daughter of William Elkins, his grandfather's business partner. The marriage had united two of Philadelphia's greatest fortunes. Harry would inherit both. He grew up surrounded by wealth that most Americans could not imagine. The family divided their time between a townhouse in Philadelphia and the sprawling estate at Elkins Park. Servants attended to every need. Tutors provided early education. The galleries of Lynnewood Hall served as his playground, where he wandered among Rembrandts and Raphaels as casually as other children explored backyards. But Harry was not drawn to paintings. From an early age, he showed a different kind of fascination. He loved books, not just reading them, holding them, examining their bindings, their paper, their typefaces. He wanted to understand how they were made, and why certain editions mattered more than others. He attended the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. The preparatory academy attracted sons of wealthy families from across the eastern seaboard. Harry proved a capable student, though not exceptional. His grades were respectable. His social connections were impeccable. What set him apart was an obsession that his classmates found peculiar. He spent his allowance on books, not popular novels or adventure stories. Harry sought out first editions, early printings, works that collectors valued for their rarity rather than their content. By the time he graduated in 1903, He had already assembled a modest collection of Robert Louis Stevenson first editions. It was a beginning. Harvard accepted him that fall. He joined the class of 1907 and threw himself into campus life. He performed in the Hasty Pudding theatricals, playing a comic husband in the production called The Lotos Eaters. The theatrical work sparked another interest. He began collecting illustrated costume books, volumes filled with engravings of historical dress. But his real education happened off campus, in the rare bookshops of Boston and New York. Harry learned to evaluate condition, provenance, and authenticity. He studied bibliographies that catalogued every significant edition of every significant author. He developed relationships with dealers who recognized his seriousness and his resources. A.S.W. Rosenbach, the Philadelphia bookseller who would become the most famous dealer in America, later praised Harry as one of the most knowledgeable young collectors he had ever encountered. The collection grew rapidly. By his mid-20s, Harry owned more than 3,000 volumes. The centerpiece was English literature from the 16th and 17th centuries. His mother gave him all 4 Shakespeare folios, including the 1623 First Folio that scholars consider the most important book in English literature. He sought out works by Caxton, Spenser, Milton, and dozens of other authors whose names appeared in the canon of English letters. His grandfather Peter watched with approval. The old man understood collecting. He recognized the same obsessive drive in Harry that had pushed him to acquire Rembrandts and Vermeers. Condition above all else. Rarity above reputation. The hunt for objects that most people would never see. Harry dreamed of building a library, not just a room in a mansion, but a proper institution, a place where scholars could study the works he had gathered, a monument to the printed word that would outlast him by centuries. He discussed the idea with his mother Eleanor, who encouraged him. He sketched plans. He made lists of acquisitions still needed to complete his vision. In 1909, he was elected to the Grolier Club in New York on the recommendation of J.P. Morgan. The society brought together the most serious bibliophiles in America. Membership was by invitation only. Henry Huntington belonged. So did other titans of industry who collected books alongside their railroads and steel mills. Harry, just 24 years old, held his own among them. He was slight of build, with dark hair and a gentle manner. Friends described him as reserved, but warm, once you earned his trust. He had inherited his mother's refined features and his father's quiet confidence. He dressed impeccably. He spoke softly. He listened more than he talked. The years after Harvard passed quickly. Harry worked in the family business while continuing to build his collection. He traveled to Europe repeatedly, visiting dealers in London and Paris who supplied the American market with volumes from aristocratic libraries. Bernard Quaritch in London became a particular favorite. Each trip added works to his shelves. Each acquisition brought him closer to the library he imagined. He was 27 years old. He had wealth, education, and a passion that gave his life meaning. He had decades ahead to build the institution he envisioned. In the spring of 1912, he traveled to Europe once more. His parents accompanied him. They had business in Paris and London. Harry had books to buy. They booked their return passage on a new ship, the largest and most luxurious vessel ever built. Everyone said it was unsinkable. Chapter 6. The Fateful Voyage. The letter arrived at Luther Livingstone's office in early March 1912. Harry Widener wrote quickly, as he always did when excited. Just a few lines to tell you I am about to make a quick trip to England. We sail on Wednesday at 1 a.m. on the Mauretania and return on April 10th on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He was looking forward to the return crossing. The new ship was supposed to be magnificent, a floating palace with restaurants, a gymnasium, a swimming pool. His parents would appreciate the comfort. Harry cared more about the libraries he would visit before boarding. The trip had multiple purposes. George Widener needed to conduct business in Paris. Eleanor wanted to shop. Harry wanted books. It was the kind of arrangement prosperous families made without much discussion. Everyone got what they wanted. They sailed from New York in early March. The Mauretania carried them swiftly across the Atlantic. In Paris, they attended to social obligations and financial matters. Harry was restless. His mind was already in London. He had been outbid at a recent auction by his rival Henry Huntington. The California railroad magnate had deeper pockets and less restraint. Harry arrived in London determined to recover from the defeat. He would find volumes that Huntington had overlooked. At Bernard Quaritch's shop on Grafton Street, Harry found what he was looking for. The antiquarian bookseller had acquired prizes from the Huth sale a few months earlier. Alfred Henry Huth had been one of England's great collectors. Now his library was scattered to new owners. Quaritch showed Harry the highlights. There was a 9-volume set of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in half Morocco bindings. There were original drawings for Charles Dickens's unfinished novel, Edwin Drood. And there was a small book that made Harry's pulse quicken. Francis Bacon's Essays, the second edition, published in 1598. The volume was barely larger than a playing card. Its pages were 4 centuries old. Harry held it carefully, feeling the weight of history in his hands. He bought it for £260. The other purchases could be shipped home safely in a tin-lined trunk. Quaritch would send them ahead on another vessel. But the little Bacon was too precious to let out of his sight. Harry would carry it himself. He joked with Quaritch as he tucked the volume into his jacket. If he was ever shipwrecked, at least he would have something to read. By early April, the family's business in Europe was complete. They travelled to Cherbourg, where the new White Star liner would stop on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. On the afternoon of April 10th, 1912, they boarded the RMS Titanic. The ship exceeded every expectation. 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, a grand staircase beneath a wrought iron and glass dome, promenades where passengers could stroll as if on a seaside boulevard, first-class accommodations that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. The Wideners occupied adjoining suites on C deck. George and Eleanor took cabin C80. Harry had C82 next door. George's valet Edwin Keeping and Eleanor's maid Amelie Giger attended to their needs. The crossing would take less than a week. They would be home by April 17th. The first days passed pleasantly. The weather was calm. The company was distinguished. The Titanic carried some of the most prominent passengers ever assembled on a single vessel. John Jacob Astor was aboard with his young bride. Benjamin Guggenheim travelled with his valet and mistress. Isidor Straus, the department store magnate, sailed with his wife Ida. The Wideners knew many of these people from Philadelphia society. They dined together. They played cards. They discussed business and art and the changing world. On the evening of Sunday, April 14th, George and Eleanor hosted a dinner party in the first-class restaurant. The guest of honour was Captain Edward John Smith. Many believed this voyage would be his last before retirement. The White Star Line had given him command of their greatest ship as a tribute to his long career. The evening was elegant, crystal, silver, multiple courses, fine wines. Conversation flowed easily among people accustomed to such gatherings. Captain Smith was gracious and attentive. He had commanded transatlantic voyages for decades. He knew how to put passengers at ease. Harry sat with his parents, the little Bacon tucked safely in his cabin nearby. In 4 days, he would be back at Lynnewood Hall, adding his London acquisitions to the shelves. He would show his grandfather the Gibbon set. He would write to Rosenbach about the Edwin Drood drawings. He would begin planning his next trip. The dinner ended around 10:30. The guests dispersed. Some went to the smoking room. Others retired for the night. Outside, the North Atlantic lay flat and still beneath a moonless sky. The temperature had dropped steadily throughout the day. The water was barely above freezing. 400 miles ahead, something waited in the darkness. Chapter 7. The Final Hours. At 11:40 that night, the lookout spotted ice directly ahead. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the engines stopped and the ship turned hard to port. For 37 seconds, the bow swung slowly left. It was not enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side below the waterline, buckling steel plates and opening 6 compartments to the sea. The collision barely registered in first class. Passengers felt a slight shudder, a grinding vibration that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Some thought the ship had dropped a propeller blade. Others assumed they had struck a smaller vessel. Most went back to sleep. George Widener was still awake. He went to investigate and returned with news that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The forward compartments were filling rapidly. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was already below, calculating how long they had. The answer was 2 hours, perhaps less. By midnight, the crew had uncovered the lifeboats and begun preparing them for launch. Captain Smith gave the order for women and children first. The band assembled on the boat deck and began to play, their music drifting across the still night air. The Wideners made their way to the port side, where Second Officer Charles Lightoller supervised the loading. The scene was orderly at first. Many passengers still believed the danger was exaggerated. The lifeboats swung out over black water 70 feet below. Some women refused to leave their husbands for what seemed like a fragile wooden craft dangling in the darkness. Eleanor, George, and Harry waited near lifeboat 4. The boat had been lowered to a deck, but there was confusion about how to load passengers through the enclosed promenade windows. More than an hour passed as the crew struggled to open them. The ship was listing now, her bow sinking lower with each passing minute. The lights flickered, but held. Around 1:50 in the morning, lifeboat 4 was finally ready. George and Harry helped Eleanor and her maid Amelie into the boat. Then they stepped back. Eleanor looked up at her husband and son standing at the rail. She would remember that moment for the rest of her life. A friend named William Carter urged Harry to find a place in one of the remaining boats. Harry refused. "I think I will stick to the big ship, Billy, and take a chance." Those were among the last words anyone heard him speak. The lifeboat pulled away. Eleanor watched as the great ship settled deeper. Her stern rose slowly, lifting the propellers clear of the surface. The lights finally went dark. Then came a sound like thunder as everything inside broke loose and tumbled forward. At 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic broke apart and slipped beneath the waves. More than 1,500 people died in the North Atlantic that night. The lifeboats drifted in the darkness, their occupants listening to cries that gradually faded to silence. Help would not arrive for another 2 hours. George and Harry Widener were among the dead. Their bodies were never recovered. The Little Bacon, the book Harry had carried from London, went down with him. A legend later emerged that he had gone back to his cabin to retrieve it in those final moments. His mother never confirmed the story. What she saw, she kept mostly to herself. Eleanor survived. She was 50 years old. She had lost her husband of nearly 30 years, and the son who had been the center of her world. The Carpathia picked up the survivors at dawn and carried them to New York. Eleanor returned to Philadelphia on a private train. She walked back into Lynnewood Hall, where her father-in-law Peter waited with the news he had already received by telegram. 2 of the 3 Widener men were gone. Chapter 8. A Father's Grief. Peter Widener received the telegram at Lynnewood Hall on the morning of April 16th. He was 77 years old. He had buried his wife 16 years earlier. He had buried his first son, Harry, when the boy was 11. Now George and young Harry were gone too, swallowed by the same Atlantic Ocean that had carried his investments across the world. The newspapers called it the worst maritime disaster in history. More than 1,500 dead. The ship that everyone said could not sink had vanished in less than 3 hours. Peter had helped pay for that ship. His investment in International Mercantile Marine had made him a partial owner of the White Star Line. The irony was cruel beyond measure. When Eleanor arrived back in Philadelphia, Peter embraced her in the front hall of the mansion that suddenly felt far too large. His surviving son, Joseph, stood nearby. The household staff waited in silence. There would be no bodies to bury. The ocean kept what it took. Memorial services were held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park. The pews filled with Philadelphia's most prominent families. Stained glass windows were later dedicated to George and Harry. Their names would be read aloud in that church for generations. Peter's health began to fail almost immediately. Physicians diagnosed diabetes, but everyone understood the deeper cause. The man who had built an empire through relentless energy and unshakable will had lost his reason to continue. He spent his remaining years quietly. The grand entertainments stopped. The ballroom where 1,000 guests had once danced fell silent. Peter wandered the galleries alone, pausing before paintings that would outlast him, thinking about the grandson who had loved books the way he loved art. Harry's collection remained at Lynnewood Hall for a time. Peter had intended to help build a library at Harvard to house it. But Eleanor took over that project. She had her own grief to channel, her own memorial to construct. In the summers, Peter retreated to his yacht, cruising the New England coast and stopping at Newport to visit family. The sea that had taken so much from him still held some comfort. Perhaps it reminded him of voyages when George and Harry were still alive. Joseph managed the family's business affairs now. The younger son had always been more interested in art than streetcars, but he accepted his new responsibilities. He refined the collection at Lynnewood Hall, trading lesser works for greater ones, preparing for the day when the paintings would find a permanent home. On November 6, 1915, Peter Widener died in his bed at Lynnewood Hall. He was 80 years old. Physicians listed old age as the cause. The New York Times added what everyone already knew. Deep sorrow over the loss of his son and grandson had contributed to his decline. He had lived 3.5 years after the Titanic. He had never recovered. His body lay in state in the Van Dyck Gallery, beneath his own portrait, and surrounded by the masterpieces he had spent decades gathering. Hundreds of friends and employees filed past to pay their respects. Then he was carried to Laurel Hill Cemetery on the banks of the Schuylkill River, where he was laid to rest beside Hannah. His estate was valued at nearly $32 million. The will stipulated that the principal assets remain intact for up to 70 years, ensuring that the family's wealth would endure. Joseph inherited Lynnewood Hall and everything in it. The paintings hung in their galleries, waiting. Chapter 9. The Memorial at Harvard. Eleanor Widener transformed her grief into granite and limestone. Within weeks of returning to Philadelphia, she contacted Harvard's president Abbott Lawrence Lowell to discuss her son's book collection. Harry's will had requested that his rare volumes be donated to his alma mater. But Eleanor had something far grander in mind. She would not simply give Harvard a collection of books, she would give them an entirely new library. Harvard desperately needed one. Gore Hall, their existing library, had been declared full in 1863 and patched together with additions ever since. The Gothic structure was cramped and outdated. Eleanor's offer arrived at precisely the right moment. She chose Horace Trumbauer as architect. The same firm that had built Lynnewood Hall would now build Harry's memorial. The project's chief designer was Julian Abel, an African-American architect who had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's School of Fine Arts. Abele would create one of the most significant academic buildings in America, though his contribution went largely unrecognized for decades. Eleanor expected to spend $2 million. The final cost exceeded $3.5 million. She involved herself in every detail: the building's proportions, the materials, the placement of windows. Most importantly, the memorial rooms at the heart of the structure, where Harry's collection would be permanently housed. Gore Hall came down in early 1913. Ground was broken on February 12th. By summer, workers were laying 50,000 bricks each day. The building rose quickly, a Beaux Arts monument of Harvard brick and Indiana limestone stretching 320,000 square feet. On June 24th, 1915, commencement day, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library was dedicated. Eleanor climbed the broad front steps with President Lowell and head librarian Archibald Coolidge. At the main entrance, she presented them with the building's keys. Inside, Bishop William Lawrence offered a benediction. A portrait of Harry was unveiled. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge delivered remarks on Eleanor's behalf. Great deeds, Lodge told the assembled crowd, can arise from tragedy. The first book formally carried into the new library was a 1634 edition of John Downham's The Christian Warfare Against the Devil, World, and Flesh. At the time, scholars believed it was the only surviving volume from John Harvard's original bequest to the college in 1638. Harry would have appreciated the symbolism. His collection joined a lineage stretching back nearly 3 centuries. The memorial rooms became a shrine. Harry's books lined the walls in custom cases. His portrait watched over visitors. Eleanor left standing instructions that fresh flowers must always be kept beside her son's photograph. The same flowers appear there today, more than a century later. A persistent legend claims that Eleanor required Harvard to make swimming lessons mandatory for graduation, determined to spare other young men her son's fate. The story is romantic, but untrue. No such requirement was ever imposed as a condition of her gift. What Eleanor did require was permanence. The building's exterior could never be altered. Her son's memorial would stand exactly as she had built it, unchanged by future generations. The library she created remains the largest university library in the world. 57 miles of shelves. Capacity for more than 3 million volumes. The labyrinthine stacks descend multiple floors underground, a city of books beneath Harvard Yard. At the dedication ceremony, Eleanor expressed her hope simply: let it become the heart of the university. It did. Standing in the audience that June afternoon was a surgeon and explorer named Alexander Hamilton Rice. He held 2 Harvard degrees and was the grandson of a former Massachusetts governor. His South American expeditions had already made him famous. He and Eleanor spoke after the ceremony. 4 months later, they would be married. Chapter 10. Eleanor's Second Life. On October 6, 1915, Eleanor Elkins Widener married Alexander Hamilton Rice in Boston. Bishop William Lawrence performed the ceremony. The same bishop who had offered the benediction at the Widener Library dedication 4 months earlier now joined Eleanor to the man she had met that day. She wore her celebrated string of pearls, worth $750,000, the jewels she had saved from the Titanic while losing everything else that mattered. The newspapers called him Explorer Rice. One headline announced simply, "Explorer weds Titanic widow." Eleanor was 54 years old. She had been a society matron, a grieving mother, a philanthropist. Now she became something unexpected, an adventuress. Before the wedding, she completed Miramar. The Newport mansion had been planned with George before the Titanic voyage. 30,000 square feet of Italian Renaissance elegance overlooking the Atlantic. She opened it in 1915 with a ball attended by 500 guests, including members of the diplomatic corps. Newport society took notice. The widow had not retreated into mourning. She had built a palace. With Rice, Eleanor discovered a world beyond drawing rooms and charity balls. In 1916, they sailed from Newport aboard the yacht Alberta to explore the Amazon River basin. She was no passive observer. She traveled into the jungle alongside her husband, enduring conditions that would have defeated women half her age. The 1920 expedition made headlines. Eleanor went further up the Amazon than any white woman had ever ventured. The party encountered hostile indigenous groups. There was a violent confrontation. 2 attackers were killed. Eleanor remained on the specially constructed yacht during the worst of it, but she had willingly placed herself in that remote and dangerous place. The newspapers followed their adventures breathlessly. When no word came from the 1924 expedition for weeks, anxiety spread through New York society. A subsequent headline managed to be both alarming and absurd. Explorer Rice denies that he was eaten by cannibals. He had not been. The Rices returned safely, as they always did. In 1929, they founded Harvard's Institute of Geographical Exploration together. Eleanor provided the endowment. Rice served as director and was finally appointed professor. The institution became a center for photogrammetry, the science of making maps from aerial photographs. Rice had pioneered the technique on his Amazon expeditions, using a seaplane to survey territory that would have taken years to chart on foot. Eleanor divided her time between Newport, New York, and Paris. She and Rice traveled extensively through Europe and India when they were not exploring South America. The woman who had watched her husband and son disappear into the North Atlantic had chosen to spend her remaining years in motion, always moving toward the next horizon. On July 13th, 1937, Eleanor suffered a sudden heart attack while shopping in a Paris store. She was 75 years old. Her husband and daughter were with her in the city. Her body was returned to Philadelphia. She was interred in the Widener family mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery, beside the empty markers for George and Harry, whose bodies the ocean had never surrendered. Her crypt makes no mention of the Titanic. The cenotaphs for her husband and son do. She left an estate of $11 million. The bulk went to a trust for Rice, then to her surviving children, George Jr. and Eleanor. Her grandson, Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., would later have a college renamed in her honor. Widener University in Chester, Pennsylvania, still bears the family name. But Eleanor's truest memorial may be the life she lived after tragedy. She could have withdrawn. She could have let grief define her. Instead, she built libraries, explored rivers, and refused to let the worst night of her life become the whole of her story. Chapter 11. The Art Goes to Washington. Joseph Widener spent nearly 3 decades preparing his father's collection for immortality. After Peter's death in 1915, Joseph became the sole custodian of the paintings that lined the galleries of Lynnewood Hall. His brother George and nephew Harry had drowned 3 years earlier. The responsibility fell to him alone. He approached it with a curator's precision. Where his father had accumulated over 400 paintings, Joseph pruned and refined. He sold lesser works and acquired greater ones. He separated the galleries into distinct sections. By the time he finished, the collection contained roughly 100 paintings, each considered among the finest available examples of its artist's work. From June through October each year, Joseph opened Lynnewood Hall to the public. Visitors could walk through rooms hung with Rembrandts and Van Dycks, past Chinese porcelains and Renaissance bronzes. He installed chairs and benches for those who wished to linger. Soft music played through speakers hidden in the walls. During one viewing, a woman attacked Rembrandt's The Mill with a hatpin. The painting survived undamaged. Peter had originally intended the collection for the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But by the late 1930s, Joseph was in negotiations with a different institution entirely. The National Gallery of Art in Washington was preparing to open, funded by Andrew Mellon's bequest, and designed to house the nation's greatest artistic treasures. Joseph offered to make the Widener collection one of its founding gifts. The transfer proved complicated. Federal law required an act of Congress to allow the government to pay Pennsylvania's taxes on the gift. The legislation passed in 1942. That year, Joseph donated more than 2,000 works to the National Gallery. The paintings included Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Bellini's Feast of the Gods, 8 Van Dycks, 2 Vermeers, 14 Rembrandts, a series of portraits by Gainsborough and Reynolds. The sculptures included works by Donatello and Desiderio da Settignano. The collection also encompassed decorative arts, Chinese porcelains, and works on paper. The gift more than doubled the number of Dutch paintings in the gallery's collection. It transformed a young institution into a world-class museum almost overnight. Joseph lived only another year. He died at Lynnewood Hall on October 26, 1943, and was interred in the family mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery. The galleries that had once glowed with masterpieces now stood empty. The paintings hung in Washington, where millions would see them. But there was one final gift to give. In 1944, Harry's younger siblings completed an act their grandfather had begun 32 years earlier. George Widener Jr. and Eleanor Widener Dixon presented a Gutenberg Bible to Harvard's Widener Library. Peter had purchased the Bible while Harry was abroad, intending to surprise his grandson when the Titanic arrived in New York. Harry learned of the purchase, but not the intent. He wrote to a friend shortly before his death. "I wish it was for me, but it is not. It had always been for him. He simply never learned the truth." After Peter's death, the Bible passed to Joseph. After Joseph's death, George and Eleanor added it to their brother's collection at Harvard, where it belonged. They explained their reasoning simply. It had been bought for Harry and should be among his books. One volume of the Gutenberg Bible remains on permanent display in the memorial rooms of Widener Library, beside Harry's portrait and the fresh flowers that have appeared there every day for more than a century. It is one of only 23 complete copies known to survive. The butcher's grandson had dreamed of owning beautiful things. His descendants gave them to the nation. Chapter 12. The Last American Versailles, Today. The paintings left first, then the family, then, slowly, everything else. After Joseph Widener's death in 1943, the southern portion of the estate was sold for development. The mansion itself, its gardens, and the outbuildings found a buyer who hoped to establish a Protestant seminary. When that buyer defaulted, The property briefly returned to the Widener family before being sold again. In 1952, Faith Theological Seminary purchased Lynnewood Hall for $192,000. The seminary trained hundreds of ministers within those limestone walls for more than 4 decades. But as the institution's finances declined, its leaders began dismantling the mansion's interior. What could be removed was sold. The 18th century ballroom furniture, the salvaged European panelling, the fixtures that Peter Widener had imported from palaces across the continent. By 1996, the seminary was gone. The First Korean Church of New York acquired the property in a sheriff's sale. The new owners intended to revive it as a church and school. They never did. For nearly 3 decades, Lynnewood Hall sat vacant. The decay was relentless. Water seeped through the roof. Plaster crumbled from ceilings. Vandals broke windows. The formal gardens that had once rivaled any in America disappeared beneath decades of unchecked growth. The mansion that Time magazine had celebrated for its lavish parties in 1932 became a ruin. Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., Peter Widener's great-great-grandson, called it the last of the American Versailles. The nickname stuck. It captured both what the house had been and what it might become again. The property sat on the market for nearly a decade. Developers made offers. The owner, Reverend Richard Yoon, turned them all down. He understood what the wrong buyer would mean. The grounds subdivided, the mansion demolished, another piece of the Gilded Age erased. In 2019, a small group of preservationists quietly formed the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation. They believed the mansion could be saved. They spent years building a relationship with Reverend Yoon, gaining access to the property, cleaning debris, assessing damage. In July 2022, the foundation announced its intentions publicly. They would purchase and restore Lynnewood Hall. They would return it to the community as a place of education, culture, and public gathering. On June 27, 2023, the sale closed. The purchase price was $9 million. Scott and Susan Bentley, the foundation's principal donors, contributed $9.5 million toward acquisition and initial operations. The largest residential preservation project ever proposed in the United States had begun. The work ahead is immense. Asbestos remediation, building stabilization, restoration of the 34 acres of grounds, eventually the interior spaces themselves. The foundation estimates it will cost $1 million annually just to maintain and staff the property once restoration is complete. But the bones remain solid. The Indiana limestone walls still stand. The proportions that Horace Trumbauer perfected more than a century ago still command attention. Some precious details survived the decades of neglect. The building is wounded, not destroyed. In 2025, Lynnewood Hall was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The foundation plans to open its doors to the public in 2026. The formal gardens will be restored as a community park. The galleries will once again display art. Students will learn preservation trades by practicing them on the mansion itself. Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to keep his family together after his wife died. It did not work. His sons scattered. His grandson drowned. His great-grandchildren sold off the grounds. But the house endured. The butcher's son wanted to be remembered. He will be. Not for his streetcars or his stock holdings, but for the mansion that refused to disappear, and for the paintings that hang in Washington, and for the library that bears his grandson's name in Cambridge. The Widener fortune built monuments. The monuments outlasted everything else.